20th century capitalism and its twin brother communism, both approaches toward institutionalizing power consolidation, have arguably done more to destroy otherwise sustainable ecological and social systems than any forces known to man. The checks and balances needed to prevent dramatic swings out of homeostasis and into dangerously self-reinforcing feedback loops were ignored, despite the ideological tensions between these supposedly extreme polar positions created by their pundits as paths toward utopia. Fascisms, like weeds, were quick to exploit the no-man's lands that occurred as sustainability was sacrificed for power, and the core arguments against tyranny and exploitation, so vociferously argued by Enlightenment thinkers, were twisted and thrown into darkness. The moral authority of religions was co-opted by the capitalist system and rejected by the communist system, so that neither could be a savior for all creation, the ecosystems upon which all systems ultimately depend. Both schools of thought tried to claim the moral high ground, but were so anthropocentric in outlook that their conflict inevitably forced ecological degradation to be the outcome of every nation-building exercise. For the communist societies, the writings of the German economist Marx became the foundational theoretical framework. But these societies ignored his work on the transformation of natural capital and the dangers of the metabolic rift and other early ecological insights. For the capitalist societies, the writings of economist Adam Smith were the ones canonized in our institutions of higher learning, but they failed to even mention that Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in the context of his Theory of Moral Sentiments, the larger and more inclusive work that explains how the invisible hand can work in a capitalist society only through a rich and deep belief in morality as a guiding force for self-interest-based decisions. There were obvious benefits to power holders in pretending a rationalist outlook for the development of civilization and keeping the ecological and moral context out of the picture and out of the thinking of the elites through willful self-blinding and the plebeians through poorly designed educational systems. But here we need to explore the third space that was developed all along as deeper thinkers mused about the true role of humans in our built environment and the natural systems surrounding us, and tried to apply its insights to world creation. The movement that came out of those observations and meditations has come to be known as deep ecology. What is strongest about deep ecology is the fresh metaphors it used to describe reality. E.O. Wilson says of metaphors, quote, "The invention of language in the first place, defined as the expression of thought through sounds given arbitrary meaning, was the supreme achievement of human evolution, genetic in its origin, cultural in its elaboration. Without the invention of language, we would have remained animals. Without metaphors, we would still be savages. Metaphors invest language with emotion. Language impelled by emotion creates motivation, which drives civilization. The more advanced the civilization, the more elaborate its metaphors. Even the glossaries of physics and engineering are built with them. Metaphors set the imagination free to search for vivifying images. They allow us to cross boundaries, deliver little shocks of aesthetic surprise and humor, and thereby achieve nuance and novel perspective. Words may be arbitrary in origin, but metaphors are not. Rather, they tend to fall into categories of innate emotional response by human beings." End quote. Deep ecology uses metaphors that explicitly derive from our innate connection with the natural world, and so has more nuance and resonance than perspectives with more arbitrary connections to reality. Wilson also talks about the importance of archetypes, saying, quote, "Whereas metaphors are the building blocks of language, archetypes are part of the common groundwork of human emotion, composed of universal stories and images. Their provenance is not an accident of cultural evolution. They are part of deep history, obedient to instinctive genetic biases acquired through evolution by natural selection. Some of their ultimate causes date back tens of thousands of years to a time when humans were spreading out from Africa to all the habitable globe. Others were forged in our distant animal ancestors millions of years ago," end quote. One of the instinctive genetic biases that Wilson studies and writes about extensively is what he calls biophilia. an innate love and appreciation for nature and deep ecological systems that evolved because of its sustainability benefits. It is this explicit connection with the non-human world, a world that we only really know through the scientific method, that makes deep ecology, despite its New Age trappings, a more reliable source of metaphors and anecdotes than any worldview that came before it. Wilson decries the, quote, overly narrow focus on the human condition during present and recent historical times, end quote, stating that this, quote, narrow epistemological focus renders the humanities rootless, remaining largely unaware and uncaring about the evolutionary events of prehistory that created the human mind, page 190, and, quote, which after all created the history on which the humanities focus. Further, the creative arts and critical analyses leave unknown and unmentioned most of the non-human physical and biological processes that churn ceaselessly around and through each of us. We remain largely blind to the environment and the forces within it that guide us to whatever destiny our activities foreordain, page 191. Art without science is dangerously inadequate for designing a better world, as is science without art. The poet T.S. Eliot's assessment, says Wilson, is hard to refute. Knowledge of life obtained through fiction is only possible by another stage of self-consciousness. That is to say, it can only be a knowledge of other people's knowledge of life, not of life itself. That's Eliot, page 199. The creative arts and critical analyses leave unknown and unmentioned most of the more reliable source of metaphors and anecdotes than any worldview that came before it. Wilson decries the overly narrow focus on the human condition during present and recent historical times, stating that this narrow epistemological focus renders the humanities rootless, remaining largely unaware and uncaring about the evolutionary events of prehistory that created the human mind, page 190. And, quote, which after all created the history on which the humanities focus. Further, the creative arts and critical analyses leave unknown and unmentioned most of the non-human physical and biological processes that churn ceaselessly around and through each of us. We remain largely blind to the environment and the forces within it that guide us to whatever destiny our activities foreordain, end quote, page 191. Art without science is dangerously inadequate for designing a better world, as is science without art. The poet T.S. Eliot's assessment, says Wilson, quote, is hard to refute. Knowledge of life obtained through fiction is only possible by another stage of self-consciousness. That is to say, it can only be a knowledge of other people's knowledge of life, not of life itself. That's T.S. Eliot quoted by Wilson, page 189. Life itself, and how to know it, is the subject of deep ecology, living as if nature mattered. Its proponents, like Murray Bookchin, may have often come from socialist critiques of late-stage capitalism, but the metaphor it creates and the archetypes it uses have a universality about them that transcends any narrow epistemology. Editor Michael Tobias defines the broadness of deep ecology in his foreword to the book that brings together Bookchin, Herman Daly, Garrett Hardin, Arne Naess, Paolo Soleri, and others by saying, in contradistinction from the capitalist enterprise, quote, deep ecology concerns those personal moods, values, aesthetic and philosophical convictions which serve no necessarily utilitarian nor rational end. By definition, their sole justification rests upon the goodness, balance, truth, and beauty of the natural world and of human beings' biological and psychological need to be fully integrated within it. The technological and conceptual tendency of civilization has served to isolate our species from all others, save perhaps for certain rodents, insect scavengers, French poodles, Siamese cats, horses, spider plants, and marigolds. This isolation or lack of wilderness is biologically bereft of the very connections which normally assure a vital place in the planetary puzzle. The loons have been on Earth for 130 million years. Whales and wolves a little less. Human beings a mere 2 million years. Cybernetics and the evolution of computers adds yet another twist to human destiny, they say. This is a water planet. The first terrestrial matter was probably silicon beaches. From a computer's perspective, human beings are on Earth merely to reorganize silicon into conductive chips. From the biosphere's perspective, the whole point of Homo sapiens is their armpits, a swarm with 24.1 billion bacteria. The purpose of the brain's evolution is strictly for the transport of armpits to diversified niches, perhaps other planets. For the Earth stares out into space as is alone, aware of itself, yearning to share the gift of life. Ironically, we are the one species that can focus on the stars, and for whom the stars have meant something fantastic. The biosphere has happily managed to articulate through us, and yet we tempt her with catastrophe. This paradox is also at the heart of deep ecology. That's page 7. This capacious perspective may seem to be the height of satire, and yet a little more deep thought about the matter may tempt you to see this as the only logical conclusion once you are liberated from the intense navel staring of the capitalist, communist, socialist, humanist, anthropocentrist perspectives you have been raised to think of as truth. Certainly, the postmodern French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard came to just such a conclusion in his classic Postmodern Fables, which I was assigned to read in my graduate studies in urban planning at UCLA. He wrote about human progress, quote, "It induced an eschatological representation of the history of human systems. In the long run, the open systems won out completely over all the other systems, human, organic, and physical, locked in struggle on the surface of the planet Earth. Nothing appeared able to stop or even guide their development. Crises, wars, revolutions contributed to accelerate all this, especially by giving access to new sources of energy and by establishing new control over their exploitation. It even became necessary that the open systems temper their success over other systems in order to preserve the ensemble, called an ecosystem, from a catastrophic deregulation.